I still remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and old wood, the kind of warmth that makes a house feel like a memory before it's even over. I was sitting at the island counter in Nora's home, waiting for my best friend Jade to come downstairs, when her mother walked in and stopped dead in her tracks the moment she saw me. She didn't say a word. She just looked at me. Really looked. And then turned away to pour herself a glass of water, as if I were a stain on the wallpaper she'd learned to ignore. Her name was Renata Calloway. And from the very first day Jade introduced us, she had treated me with a cool, impenetrable distance that I had never been able to explain. Jade always said her mom was just like that. Reserved, private, a woman who had built her entire world behind a very beautiful, very controlled exterior. Renata was 43. With dark copper hair she wore in a low bun and eyes the color of stormy ocean glass, the kind of green that changes depending on the light. She was an architect, precise and deliberate in everything she did. She chose her words carefully, moved through rooms carefully, and looked at me carefully, as if I were something she was trying to figure out, or something she was trying to avoid figuring out. I was 26 and had known Jade since our second year of college. We were inseparable, the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences and show up at 2 a.m. without an explanation needed. I spent more time in that house than in my own apartment on Mercer Street. And yet, no matter how many dinners I sat through or holidays I crashed, Renata never once let me pass the surface. She was polite. Perfectly, mercilessly polite. Which, I learned, is a very elegant way of keeping someone out. That night in October, I was still at the counter when I heard it. Jade had gotten a phone call and stepped onto the back porch, leaving me alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the antique clock in the hall. And then, from the small home office just around the corner, a room whose door had been left barely open, I heard Renata's voice. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was talking to herself, or maybe into the quiet, the way people do when they've been holding something too long. What she said stopped the air in my lungs completely. It was only a sentence. One single sentence, but it cracked everything I thought I understood about her straight down the middle. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold, hearing those words loop over and over in my mind like a song I hadn't asked to learn. Because what Renata Calloway whispered in that empty room, when she thought no one was listening, changed everything between us. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that settles in your chest like gravity, that nothing about that house, that family, or that woman was ever going to feel the same again. If this story already has your heart racing, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. And before you go, drop a comment below telling us, what city and country are you watching from? We read every single one, and we love knowing where in the world our community is. I have a terrible habit of noticing things I'm not supposed to notice. The way someone holds their coffee cup tells me if they slept well. The way someone laughs, whether it reaches their eyes or stops just short of them, tells me if they're really happy or just performing happiness for the room. It's not a skill I cultivated intentionally. It's more like a frequency I was born tuned to, one I've never quite figured out how to turn off. Jade always teased me about it. She'd say, "Maya, you observe people like you're writing a report on them." And maybe she was right. But it was that same habit, that quiet, relentless attention, that first made me realize something about Renata Calloway that I couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. I met Renata on a Friday afternoon in September, 4 years before that October night in the kitchen. Jade had finally convinced me to come home with her for the weekend instead of staying in our cramped college apartment, eating cereal and watching old films. The drive to Solvang took about 2 hours, and Jade spent most of it telling me not to be nervous, which of course made me significantly more nervous. She described her mother the way you'd describe a beautiful, slightly unpredictable weather system. Something to be respected, not underestimated. "She's not mean," Jade had said, drumming her fingers on the steering wheel. "She's just selective." I nodded like I understood. I didn't understand yet. The Calloway house was a converted craftsman on a wide, tree-lined street where the sidewalks were uneven from old oak roots pushing through the concrete. It was the kind of house that had clearly been loved for decades. The paint was fresh, but the bones were old, and the front garden had the organized wildness of someone who knew exactly what they were doing but wanted it to look effortless. I remember thinking, before I even walked through the door, that the house felt like a personality. And when Renata opened the door and looked at me for the first time, measured, unhurried, with those storm glass eyes that gave nothing away, I understood immediately that the house felt exactly like her. She shook my hand. That was the first thing that surprised me. Not a hug, not the warm maternal greeting I'd gotten from Jade's college friends' mothers. A firm, deliberate handshake, like we were being introduced at a professional event rather than on her own front porch. "Maya," she said, as if she were filing the name somewhere. "Jade's told me about you." She didn't say whether what Jade had told her was good or bad. She simply turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind her in a way that was technically an invitation, but felt more like a test. I looked at Jade. Jade gave me a sheepish smile and mouthed, "I told you." I picked up my bag and followed. That weekend set the tone for the next 4 years. Renata was never rude. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because rude would have been easier to process. Rude has edges you can push back against. What Renata was, what she remained, through dozens of dinners and holidays and lazy Sunday mornings in that craftsman house, was precisely, surgically polite. She asked appropriate questions and listened to the answers with the focused patience of someone who had trained themselves to be present without being open. She remembered details, that I took my tea without sugar, that I had an older sister in Portland, that I was working toward my MFA in creative writing. She remembered everything and offered nothing in return. It was like having a conversation with a beautifully designed wall. I told myself it didn't bother me. I told myself some people were simply private, that not everyone needed to perform warmth to actually possess it, that Renata's reserve was simply the architecture of a personality I hadn't earned the right to enter yet. I believed that for a while. I was good at believing things that made the discomfort manageable. But the truth I was slower to admit, was that Renata's distance bothered me precisely because I cared what she thought of me in a way that went beyond wanting Jade's mother to like me. I wanted Renata specifically to see me. And she seemed to be doing everything in her considerable power to make sure she didn't. Jade was oblivious in the way that only people who've grown up with something can be oblivious to it. Renata's coolness was simply the climate she had grown up in. Familiar, unremarkable, not worth commenting on. "She loves you. She just doesn't show it," Jade told me once, sometime in our 3rd year of friendship, when I'd made a small, carefully worded comment about feeling like her mother didn't quite trust me. Jade said it the way you'd explain that the house was always cold in winter. Just a fact of the architecture, nothing personal. I wanted to believe her. But something in my frequency kept picking up a signal that told me it was more complicated than that. What I noticed, in the way I couldn't help noticing things, was that Renata's distance wasn't uniform. It wasn't the blanket reserve of a deeply introverted person who held everyone at arm's length equally. She was warm with Jade, genuinely, softly warm, in a way she clearly tried to contain, because she understood Jade was a grown woman now, and didn't need to be mothered at every turn. But it slipped through anyway in small moments. The way she tucked Jade's hair back without thinking. The way she kept Jade's favorite tea stocked even when Jade hadn't visited in weeks. The warmth was there. It just stopped, clean and deliberate as a closed door, whenever it reached me. There was one evening in particular, about 2 years into my friendship with Jade, that I've replayed more times than I can count. It was summer, and the 3 of us had spent the afternoon in the backyard, stringing lights for a small dinner party Renata was hosting that evening. Jade had gone inside to change, and Renata and I were alone for exactly 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the garden wall with the focused desperation of someone waiting for a situation to resolve itself. We were untangling a string of lights together, and the work required us to be close, to hand sections back and forth, to occasionally speak. And Renata did speak. She asked me about a short story I'd mentioned submitting to a literary journal. She remembered the title. She asked if I'd heard back. And for those 4 minutes, her storm-glass eyes were entirely unguarded, and she looked at me like I was someone she genuinely wanted to know. Then Jade came back through the screen door, and the door closed again, just like that. I spent a long time after that evening telling myself I had imagined it. It was easier that way, because the alternative, that Renata Calloway was choosing to close that door, specifically and deliberately, every single time, raised questions I wasn't ready to ask. Questions about why. Questions about what she was protecting herself from. Questions that lived in the back of my mind like a low hum I could ignore during the day, but couldn't quite silence at night, when the house on the tree-lined street in Solvang felt like the most important place in the world, and I couldn't entirely explain why. It wasn't until that Tuesday in October, 4 years after the handshake on the front porch, that I finally stopped being afraid of those questions. Because Renata, in one unguarded moment, had answered all of them without meaning to. There is a particular kind of knowing that doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock on the front door and announce itself with clarity and clean edges. It seeps in, the way water finds its way through old walls. Slowly, quietly, through the smallest cracks, until one day you press your hand to the surface and realize the damage has been happening for a long time. That was how my understanding of Renata Calloway came to me. Not in a single revelation, but in an accumulation of details so small that none of them alone would have meant anything. Together, though, they built a portrait I couldn't stop looking at. After that October night, I stopped pretending I wasn't looking. I let myself see. The first thing I noticed, really noticed with intention, was her books. Renata had built-in shelves that ran the entire length of the living room wall, floor to ceiling, filled with the kind of curated collection that tells you everything about a person if you know how to read it. Architecture journals, obviously. Art history. A long row of translated Latin American novels. Poetry. Bishop, Oliver, Rich. And tucked between a volume of Adrienne Rich and a worn paperback of Isabel Allende, a small book I recognized immediately. A collection of personal essays by an author I had written about in my MFA thesis. The spine was cracked. The pages were soft at the corners. It had been read more than once and read carefully. I stood in front of that shelf for a long moment, my heart doing something quiet and complicated in my chest, thinking about the fact that Renata had never once mentioned it. Not in 4 years of knowing I was a writer, not once. I started paying attention to the photographs next. The Calloway house was not the kind of home that displayed family photos in obvious sentimental clusters. There was no gallery wall, no collection of frames on the mantel. The photographs were sparse and deliberate, placed the way Renata placed everything, with the precision of someone who understood that what you choose to display is a kind of language. There was one of Jade at around 12, laughing at something off-camera, on a beach somewhere with the particular golden light of late afternoon. There was a black and white print of what looked like a European city street. And on the highest shelf, half hidden behind a small ceramic vase, there was a photograph I had never noticed before. 2 women, young, standing in front of a mountain range I didn't recognize, their shoulders pressed together with the easy intimacy of people who have forgotten the camera is there. Renata was one of them. I recognized her even at what must have been her mid-20s. Same posture, same quality of stillness. The other woman was laughing. Renata was looking at her. I didn't ask Jade about it directly. I wasn't ready to be that transparent with myself, let alone with her. but I found a way to bring it up sideways. The way you do when you want an answer but don't want to explain why you're asking. We were washing dishes together after dinner one evening, the kind of domestic rhythm we'd fallen into so naturally over the years that neither of us thought about it anymore. And I mentioned casually that I'd noticed the photo on the top shelf, the one with the mountains. Jade glanced up briefly, then back at the plate in her hands. "Oh," she said. "That's from before I was born. Mom never really talks about it." She handed me the plate to dry. There was a pause that had a particular texture to it, not uncomfortable but careful. Then she added quietly, almost to herself, "I think she was really happy then. And then something happened and she just put it away, all of it." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. That conversation settled into me and stayed. I thought about it on the drive back to my apartment on Mercer Street, with the city lights blurring past the window and the radio playing something low and instrumental that matched the mood in my chest exactly. I thought about what it meant to put happiness away, to decide at some point that the risk of it wasn't worth the weight of what came after. I had done smaller versions of that myself. Everyone has. But the scale of what Jade was describing, the sense that Renata had packed up an entire version of herself and sealed the box and placed it on the highest shelf where it was visible but untouchable, made something in me ache in a way I recognized as important. I understood that kind of self-protection. I understood it more than I wanted to admit. The weeks between that October night and the storm in November were a quiet recalibration. I moved through the Calloway house differently now, with more awareness, more care, the way you move through a room where someone is sleeping and you don't want to disturb anything. I watched Renata in the small, unperformed moments that happened between the moments everyone else was paying attention to. The way she stood at the kitchen window in the early morning, before anyone else was awake, holding her coffee with both hands and looking at the garden with an expression I could only describe as longing, though I wasn't sure what she was longing for. The way she laughed, fully and without reservation, exactly once, at something absurd Jade said over dinner, and then caught herself, as if the fullness of it had surprised her, and pulled it back into something more composed. I noticed, too, the way she had begun to look at me differently. Or perhaps she had always looked at me this way, and I had only just developed the language to read it. It was subtle. Renata was constitutionally incapable of being unsubtle. But it was there. A half-second longer before she looked away. A question asked about my writing that went one layer deeper than the surface. One afternoon, I arrived at the house before Jade was back from her pottery class, and Renata opened the door and said, without any of the usual careful neutrality, "Oh, good. It's you." Just that. 3 words. Then she stepped aside to let me in and went back to the architectural drawings spread across the dining room table, as if she hadn't said anything remarkable at all. But I stood in the entryway for a beat longer than necessary because, oh good. "It's you from Renata Calloway" felt like a declaration. I didn't know what to do with any of it. I was 26 years old, and I was very good at observation and very bad at conclusion. I could read the signals with precision and still find 100 reasonable explanations that kept everything safely in the category of friendly, of appropriate, of nothing that needed to be examined too closely. Jade was my best friend. Renata was her mother. The architecture of those facts was solid and load-bearing, and I was not in the habit of testing the walls of things that were holding other things up. So I watched, and I noticed, and I filed everything carefully away in the part of myself that was still pretending it wasn't building a case. It was Jade, unwittingly, who finally gave me the last piece I needed to understand what I was looking at. We were on the phone one evening. She was at a ceramics workshop overnight and had called just to talk, the way we sometimes did when one of us needed the company of a familiar voice. And somehow the conversation drifted toward Renata, as it often did. Jade mentioned, with the casual tone of someone sharing old news, that her mother had been in a serious relationship once, years before Jade could remember much of it, with someone she had loved deeply, "It ended badly," Jade said. "Like, really badly. And she just never really opened back up after that." She paused. "The person she was with, it wasn't a man, by the way. Mom never made a big thing of it. It's just part of who she is. She doesn't talk about it." Another pause. Softer. "I think losing that relationship made her decide that wanting things too much was dangerous." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, and the apartment quiet around me, and something vast and clarifying moved through my understanding like weather. Every piece I had been collecting, the Adrian Rich on the shelf, the photograph on the highest shelf, the half second too long before she looked away, the "oh good, it's you" at the door, rearranged itself into a shape I could finally name. Renata wasn't cold. Renata was careful. There was a profound difference between the two, and I had spent 4 years confusing one for the other. She hadn't been keeping me at a distance because she disliked me. She had been keeping me at a distance because some part of her, the part she had sealed in a box and placed where it was visible but untouchable, recognized something. And recognition, for someone who had decided that wanting things too much was dangerous, was the most frightening thing in the world. The storm came without much warning. The forecast had mentioned a chance of rain the way forecasts sometimes do, vaguely, non-committally, as if the weather itself hadn't decided yet. By the time Jade and I were sitting in the living room of the Calloway house that Friday evening in November, the sky had made up its mind completely. Rain came down in heavy, wind-blown sheets against the windows, and the lights in the neighborhood flickered once, twice, then steadied themselves with the fragile confidence of something that knew it might not last the night. Jade had lit candles on the coffee table preemptively, and the room had taken on the particular warmth of a place that has closed itself against the outside world and decided to be enough on its own. I remember thinking it was the coziest I had ever felt in that house. I also remember thinking, with a quiet unease I tried to ignore, that Renata was home. She had been in her office most of the evening, the small room around the corner where I had heard her voice that October night. The room I had not been able to think about without my chest doing something involuntary ever since. Jade had knocked on the door twice to offer tea, which Renata accepted both times with brief, grateful words that drifted out into the hallway and dissolved before they reached me on the couch. I had brought a book. I was not reading it. I was listening to the rain and the low music Jade had put on, and the occasional sound of Renata moving in the room around the corner, and I was doing the thing I always did, noticing, cataloging, trying to decode the frequency of a presence that communicated everything in a language made entirely of restraint. Jade fell asleep before 10. This was not unusual. She had driven 3 hours that day for a ceramics supply run and had spent the last hour on the couch with her head tilted back and her breathing deepening in the slow, unself-conscious way of someone who has fully surrendered to exhaustion. I draped the blanket from the armchair over her and turned the music down to almost nothing and sat for a while in the candlelight, listening to the storm intensify outside. The roads, I knew, were not going to be navigable for a while. My apartment was 40 minutes away on a good night. I checked my phone and saw that 2 streets in the neighborhood were already flooded, which was the kind of practical information that made a decision for you, so you didn't have to make it yourself. I was staying. The question was what to do with that fact. I heard the office door open. I heard footsteps, unhurried, deliberate. And then Renata appeared in the living room doorway, still in the clothes she'd been wearing all day. Her copper hair half escaped from its bun, in the way that happened when she'd been running her hands through it while she worked. She took in the scene. Jade asleep on the couch, the candles, the storm pressing itself against the windows, and me, sitting in the armchair with an unread book in my lap, looking back at her. Something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to contain before it settled back into composure. "The roads," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know," I said. "I was just about to find a blanket." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Come have tea instead." I followed her into the kitchen. It was the most natural thing in the world, and also the most significant thing that had happened in 4 years. And I was very careful not to let either of those truths show on my face. Renata moved through the kitchen with the same economy of motion she brought to everything, filling the kettle, retrieving 2 mugs from the cabinet with the ease of someone who has performed this ritual 10,000 times and finds genuine comfort in its repetition. I sat at the island counter, in the same seat I'd been in that October night, and watched her and said nothing, because the silence felt like something she needed to set the pace of, and I had learned, finally, to let her. The kettle began to heat. The rain knocked against the kitchen window. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. She set a mug in front of me. No sugar, which she remembered without asking. And then settled onto the stool across the counter, with her own mug held in both hands. And we sat with the steam rising between us and the storm doing everything that needed to be done atmospherically outside, and she said, "I owe you something." I wrapped my hands around my mug and waited. Renata looked down at her tea, then back up at me with the directness she reserved for things she had decided to say out loud, which was rare enough that it always felt significant. "I heard you that night," she said. "In October. I heard you in the kitchen when I was in the office. I knew the door was open. I knew you could hear me." The words landed quietly, without drama, the way true things often do. I didn't say what I said by accident, Maya. The kitchen contracted around us. Or maybe I just stopped being aware of anything beyond the 6 feet of counter between us and the expression on Renata Calloway's face, which was the most undefended I had ever seen it. Not broken open, not collapsed, but simply unlocked, the way a window looks different when it's been released from the latch even before it's been lifted. I breathed carefully. "What did you say?" I asked, even though I had been carrying the exact words since October, folded and refolded until they were soft at the creases. I wanted her to say them again. I wanted to hear what they sounded like when she wasn't alone. She looked at me steadily, and then she said it again, the same sentence, in the same low, unperformed voice. "I keep thinking about her, and I don't know what to do with that." The honesty of it was staggering. Not because the words were dramatic, they weren't, but because I understood, given everything I knew about how carefully Renata Calloway managed the distance between herself and anything that might reach her, exactly how much it had cost her to say them. Out loud. Twice. To me. I didn't fill the silence immediately. I let it breathe, the way you let something fragile settle before you reach for it. And then I said, as quietly and as clearly as I could, "I think you do know what to do with it. I think you've known for a while. I think it just scares you." She looked at me for a long moment. Her jaw tightened slightly, not with displeasure, but with the particular tension of someone encountering an accurate thing they weren't entirely prepared for. Then, slowly, the tension released. And she said, "Yes, it does." What followed was 2 hours of conversation, unlike any we had ever had. Unlike any I had perhaps ever had with anyone, in the particular quality of its honesty. We talked about her past without me asking directly, because she had apparently decided tonight was the night she was finished with the careful omissions. She told me about the relationship she'd had in her late 20s with a woman named Claire, who had loved her loudly and generously, and without any of the restraint that Renata had tried to bring to the whole endeavor. She told me it had ended not because of anything dramatic or final, but because Renata had kept so much of herself in reserve that Claire eventually understood she was loving someone who had decided, on some fundamental level, not to be fully loved. "She said I was like a house with all the curtains drawn," Renata said. She said she knew there were lights on inside, but she could never get in. She said this without self-pity, with the measured tone of someone who has had a long time to understand a hard truth and has made a kind of peace with it. I thought about the house on the tree-lined street, with its organized wildness out front, and its built-in shelves and its sparse, deliberate photographs. I thought about the curtains in the living room, which Renata always kept partially drawn even on the brightest afternoons, and I thought about how a metaphor can live inside a life so completely that you stop being able to see where the metaphor ends and the person begins. "Do you think you still do that?" I asked. "Keep the curtains drawn?" She was quiet for a moment. The storm had softened outside, still raining, but with less insistence now, as if it too had settled into something more sustainable. "I think I've been doing it so long that I sometimes forget there's another option," she said. Then she looked at me with those storm glass eyes, which were, at that moment, entirely unstormy, clear and still and direct. And then sometimes something reminds me. I didn't ask her what had reminded her. I didn't need to. We both understood, in the way that two people understand something when they've finally stopped pretending they don't. That we had arrived somewhere together, that neither of us had planned to arrive at, and neither of us was going to pretend away. The candles in the living room had burned low. Jade was still asleep on the couch, breathing in the deep, even rhythm of someone entirely unaware that the world had just rearranged itself in the next room. Renata walked me to the guest room at the end of the hallway and paused at the door, and in the dim light of the corridor, she looked at me with the expression I had been collecting evidence of for 4 years, the one she usually caught and corrected before it could fully form. This time, she let it stay. "Good night, Maya," she said. And the way she said my name, like it was something she had been holding carefully and was finally allowing herself to set down in the open, was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me in my life. There is a difference between a door being opened and a door being left open. The first is an event, sudden, decisive, a moment you can point to and say there, that is when everything changed. The second is quieter and more fragile and, I would argue, more meaningful. It requires a continuous choice. Every morning, you have to decide again not to close it. In the weeks that followed the storm, that was what Renata did. She left the door open. Not wide. She was constitutionally incapable of wide, and I had stopped wanting her to be someone she wasn't. But open enough that light came through, and I could feel the warmth of it from where I stood. And I understood that the warmth was intentional. She was choosing it. Every day she was choosing it. I found that more extraordinary than I could adequately explain. The first thing that changed was the mornings. I had started spending more weekends in Solvang. Jade had picked up a Saturday morning pottery class in town and was often gone by 8, which left the Calloway house in a particular state of early morning quiet that I had always loved and never quite had access to before. Now, Renata didn't retreat to her office when she heard me in the kitchen. She came in. She made coffee, real coffee, in the old Italian stovetop pot that gurgled and hissed on the burner like a small, opinionated creature. And she sat at the kitchen table with her drawings or her reading, and I sat across from her with my notebook, and we existed in the same silence in a way that felt nothing like the silences before. The old silences had been managed. These ones were shared. There is an enormous difference, and the body knows it before the mind catches up. She asked about my writing with a specificity that continued to catch me off guard. Not, "How's the writing going?" The well-meaning, surface-level question that people who don't really want to know ask to be polite, but real questions, the kind that required me to actually think before answering. She asked what I was afraid of in a particular piece I'd mentioned. She asked whether I wrote toward an ending or discovered it. She asked one morning over coffee when the garden outside was silver with early frost, whether I thought honesty in writing was the same as honesty in life, or whether the page gave you a kind of permission that real life didn't. I put my pen down and looked at her across the table and said, "That is the most interesting question anyone has asked me in months." She looked pleased in the contained way she had, a small, private curve at the corner of her mouth that I was learning to read as the equivalent of a full smile from anyone else. "I've been saving it," she said. The market happened on a Thursday, which was not a day I was usually in Solvang. I had driven up on an impulse, the kind I'd been giving myself more permission to follow lately, to return a book I'd borrowed, and to drop off a plant cutting Jade had asked for and then promptly forgotten about, because Jade had the attention span of someone who was always halfway into the next idea. Jade wasn't home. Renata was, and she was pulling on her coat in the hallway when I arrived, car keys in hand, about to drive to the farmer's market 2 streets over before it closed for the afternoon. She looked at me on the doorstep with my borrowed book and my small pot of trailing vine, and said, without any particular fanfare, "Come with me. Not would you like to come, or if you're not busy, just come with me," in the tone of someone who has decided to stop making things more complicated than they need to be. The market was small and unhurried in the way of Thursday afternoon markets, when the weekend crowds haven't arrived yet, and the vendors are relaxed and willing to talk. We moved through it slowly, without agenda. Renata knew several of the vendors by name: the woman with the herb bundles, the older man who sold honey in mismatched jars, the young couple at the bread stall who always saved her a specific sourdough loaf without being asked. I watched her interact with each of them with a warmth she deployed in small, precise doses, and I thought about how much of a person exists in the spaces between their public and private selves, in the texture of small, ordinary transactions, in the way they hold a bunch of rosemary and bring it to their nose before deciding. I was learning Renata in the way you learn a language you've heard in the background your whole life, and are only now beginning to actually study, finding grammar in the gestures, vocabulary in the pauses. We were at the end of the market, at a small stall selling late-season persimmons arranged in shallow wooden crates, when it happened. I had picked one up to examine it, the particular deep orange of them, almost translucent in the afternoon light. And I was saying something about the color, something about how it was exactly the shade a poet would invent if they needed a word for almost winter, when I felt Renata's hand close over mine. Not a grab, not a redirect, just her hand covering mine, both of us holding the persimmon in the thin November air. She was looking at the fruit, not at me, but her hand was warm and entirely deliberate, and neither of us moved for a moment that stretched long enough to mean something. Then she said quietly, "You see everything in color, don't you?" It wasn't a question. It was the tone of someone making a small, careful addition to their understanding of another person. I said, "Only the things worth keeping." She didn't respond to that. She just kept her hand where it was for another beat, and then released it gently, and moved on to the next stall, and I stood there with the persimmon in my palm, feeling like the world had just tilted 2 degrees in a direction I very much wanted to go. The drive back to the house was quiet in the good way, the way of people who have stopped needing to fill space and have started trusting it instead. Renata drove with the window cracked despite the cold, and the smell of the market came with us for a while. Rosemary, bread, the mineral edge of late autumn air. I watched the town slide past and thought about all the versions of this drive I might have taken. The one where I'd stayed in my apartment on Mercer Street. The one where I'd read something clear and uncomplicated into Renata's distance and simply stopped coming to Solvang. The versions where I'd been more sensible. I was very glad I had not been more sensible. Renata parked in the driveway and we carried the bags in together. And in the kitchen she put the persimmons in the ceramic bowl on the counter and stood back and looked at them with the expression she wore when she'd placed something correctly in a design. Satisfied, considered, resolved. Jade came home that evening to find us at the kitchen table, with a half-eaten wheel of cheese and 2 glasses of wine, and a conversation about architecture that had started with me asking about the drawings in Renata's office, and had expanded into something much larger about how spaces shape the people who inhabit them, and whether a person's internal life leaves a physical impression on the rooms they spend time in, and whether it's possible to build a space that actually changes how someone feels about themselves over time. Jade stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, taking in the scene, and her expression did something I had never seen it do before, a brief, unguarded surprise, soft at the edges, like someone encountering something they had hoped for, but not expected to actually find. Then she dropped her bag and pulled up a chair and said, "Okay, I need to catch up, pour me a glass." and we let her in, and the evening settled into something the three of us had never quite had before. Easy, warm, entirely unperformed. But later, after Jade had gone to bed and I was gathering my things in the hallway to drive back to Mercer Street, Renata walked me to the door the way she always did, and this time she stood in the doorway while I went down the porch steps, and I turned at the bottom to say goodnight. And she was leaning against the door frame with her arms loosely crossed, and the warm light of the hallway behind her. And she looked at me with an expression I had no language for yet, but was very committed to learning. "Same time next week?" she said. The casualness of it was so characteristically Renata, underplaying everything that mattered, keeping the register low, letting the meaning carry itself without assistance, that I actually laughed, out loud in the cold November dark. "Same time next week," I said. She nodded once, like we had agreed on something practical and binding. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door, and I stood on the path for a moment in the dark, with my heart doing something loud and grateful in my chest, looking up at the lit windows of the house that had always felt like a personality, and thinking that I was finally beginning to understand it. I had been rehearsing the conversation with Jade for 11 days. I know because I counted. I rehearsed it in the shower, and on the drive to Solvang, and in the margins of my notebook, where I was supposed to be working on my thesis, and at 2 a.m. when sleep decided it had better things to do than cooperate. I rehearsed every version, the one where Jade laughed it off, the one where she went quiet in the particular way that meant she was hurt, the one where she said something I hadn't anticipated, and I had no prepared response, and simply had to stand there being honest without a script. That last version was the one I was most afraid of, which is probably why it was the one that actually happened. Real conversations rarely follow the draft. They go where the truth takes them, and the truth, in my experience, is not interested in your preparation. The decision to tell her came on a Sunday morning in early December, when the Calloway house smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the garden outside was crystalline with the first hard frost of the season. Jade and I were sitting on the back porch wrapped in separate blankets, the way we had done 100 times before, and she was telling me about a man she'd met at her ceramics class, a sculptor named Dominic, who had kind eyes and terrible taste in music, and had asked her to dinner twice in a way that made her think he was probably worth saying yes to. She was happy. Glowing, actually, in the way she got when something good was beginning, and watching her I felt simultaneously overjoyed for her and acutely aware that I had been carrying something around in my chest for weeks that she didn't know about, and that carrying it was starting to feel like a kind of deception I hadn't agreed to practice on the person I loved most. "I need to tell you something," I said, between one sentence and the next, without fanfare or preamble, the way you sometimes have to do things before the fear talks you out of them. Jade turned to look at me over her coffee mug. She had known me long enough to read the weight of a sentence before its content arrived. She set the mug down on the porch railing and gave me her full attention, which was one of Jade's great gifts, the completeness of her attention when it mattered. I looked at the frost on the garden, and then at her, and then at the garden again, and I told her. Not dramatically, not with excessive qualification or apology. I just told her the truth in the plainest language I could find, the way I had learned from Renata that plain language, used with care, is its own form of respect. I told her what I had been noticing, what had been growing, what the storm night had opened and the week since had slowly, carefully continued to open. Jade was quiet for a long time after I finished. Long enough that the cold settled more firmly around us, and a bird crossed the frost-white garden, and the wood smoke smell from the neighbor's chimney drifted over the fence, and I catalogued all of it with the desperate attention of someone who doesn't know where else to put their anxiety. Then she said, "How long?" Just that, I told her. She nodded slowly, looking at the garden, working through something internal at a pace I recognized as her own. Jade processed things the way she worked with clay, slowly and with her hands, feeling for the shape before she decided what it was going to be. "Does she know you're telling me?" she asked. I shook my head. "This was mine to do first," I said. Jade nodded again. Another long pause. Then she turned to look at me fully, and her expression was not what I had rehearsed for. It was not hurt or betrayal or the specific complicated grief of someone who has lost a version of a relationship they depended on. It was something softer and more searching than any of that. "My mom hasn't been happy in a really long time, Maya," she said. Her voice was even, but there was something careful underneath it, the way a river is calm on the surface when it's deepest. Like, not genuinely, quietly happy. Not the kind that doesn't need an audience. She looked down at her coffee, then back at me. I've watched her manage her life for years. Manage everything. Her feelings, her space, her distance from anything that might actually reach her. And I've never known how to help with that, because you can't help someone open up who has decided that closed is the only safe option. She paused. But I've noticed her lately, these past few weeks. There's something different. Another pause, the weight of it precise and intentional. She hums when she cooks now. She never used to hum. I felt something move through me at that, a wave of feeling so complete and unexpected that I had to look away for a moment at the frost-covered garden and breathe it down to a manageable size. Jade reached over and put her hand on my blanketed knee and squeezed once, firmly, in the way of someone delivering something important through touch because words have reached their limit. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't strange," she said, "because it is. It's genuinely strange. And I'm going to need some time to figure out what box to put it in, because I don't currently have a box for this." A short, surprised laugh escaped her, and then I laughed too. And the laughter broke the tension like a window opened in a stuffy room. And for a moment, we were just ourselves, Maya and Jade on the back porch in the cold, 26 years of friendship, and 4 years of knowing each other, and all the complicated, irreducible love of that. And it was enough. It was more than enough. The conversation with Renata happened that same evening. Jade engineered it with the subtle, purposeful grace of someone who had decided what she thought and was now quietly arranging the circumstances for everyone else to catch up. She announced at dinner that she'd promised Dominic she'd call him back and disappeared upstairs with her phone, leaving Renata and me at the kitchen table with the remains of dinner and the particular quality of privacy that is more meaningful when it has been deliberately given. Renata looked at the ceiling briefly in the direction of Jade's footsteps, and then at me, and the corner of her mouth moved in that small, private way. "She is deeply unsubtle," she said. "She gets it from her father," I said. Renata laughed, fully, without catching herself. The kind of laugh I had only witnessed once before, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and I decided in that moment that I would spend considerable energy for the foreseeable future trying to produce that sound as frequently as possible. When the laughter settled, we were left with the quiet and each other and the thing that had been building between us for weeks, which no longer needed to be managed or maintained at a careful distance, but simply acknowledged. "I talked to Jade today," I said. Renata went still. Not with alarm, but with the focused attentiveness of someone receiving important information and giving it the full weight of their presence. "And?" she said. "She said you hum when you cook now," I said. "She said you never used to." Something happened in Renata's face. Something that started deep and moved to the surface slowly, the way light moves through water. And by the time it arrived, it was the most unguarded expression I had ever seen on a face that had spent years perfecting the art of guardedness. She looked at me across the kitchen table, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. And then she said very quietly, "I didn't realize I was doing that." "That's the point," I said. "That's exactly the point." She looked at me steadily, and I looked back. And between us was the table and the candle Jade had lit, before excusing herself, and the remains of dinner and 4 years of accumulated noticing and 11 days of rehearsed conversations and 1 storm and 1 market and 1 persimmon in the November light and the sound of her saying my name like it was something she'd been holding carefully and had finally set down in the open. It was a lot of material. It was the right amount of material. Renata reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Not the tentative, accidental touch of the market, but something deliberate and unhurried, a choice made with full awareness of its weight. And I turned my hand over so our palms were together, and her fingers found mine, and we sat like that while the candle burned and the house settled around us into its nighttime sounds. We didn't name it that evening. We didn't draw borders around it or establish terms or have the practical, clarifying conversation that I knew would need to happen eventually about what we were and what we were choosing. That conversation would come, and it would be characteristically Renata, clear-eyed and honest, and slightly more organized than the situation probably required. But that night we simply sat in the kitchen of the house on the tree-lined street in Solvang, with the frost forming again outside, and Jade's footsteps moving quietly overhead, and our hands on the table between us. And Renata said eventually, "I've been afraid of this for a long time." And I said, "I know." And she said, "I'm not sure I'm not still afraid." And I said, "That's all right. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at me then with the full weight of those storm glass eyes, which were, at that moment, the color of the ocean on a clear day, transparent and deep and lit from within. And something in them settled, visibly, like a house finally ceasing to brace against the weather. I think about that evening often, in the way you return to things that rearranged you. Not because it was the most dramatic moment of what came after. It wasn't. What came after was quieter and more ordinary, and more sustaining than any single dramatic moment could be. But because it was the moment I understood what it means to choose someone who has been long practiced in not being chosen. It doesn't happen in a declaration. It doesn't happen in the grand gesture or the perfectly constructed sentence. It happens in the staying, in the hand on the table, in the simple, repeated, daily decision to remain present in front of someone who has every historical reason to expect you to leave, until eventually, not all at once, not without fear, but genuinely, sustainably, they begin to believe that you won't. Renata Calloway had spent years with the curtains drawn. I was not in a hurry. I had a great deal of patience, and I had learned, from the woman herself, that the best things are not placed. They are chosen, deliberately, and then chosen again. And that, to anyone who has loved someone who forgot how to let themselves be loved, is exactly where our story begins. I am 31 years old, and I am sitting at a desk in a room that used to be a storage space. Renata converted it for me 8 months ago, on a weekend in April when the wisteria on the back fence was in full bloom, and she decided, with the quiet decisiveness that characterizes every meaningful thing she has ever done, that I needed a proper place to write. She didn't ask if I wanted it. She simply appeared in the doorway of the room one Saturday morning, with architectural drawings already sketched on graph paper, and said, "I've been thinking about the light in here. It's good light. You should have it." I looked at the drawings, and then at her, and then at the drawings again, and I understood that this was Renata's language for something she still found difficult to say directly. That she had been thinking about my comfort in a space we now shared. That she had been paying attention. That she wanted me to stay. I said, "The light is perfect." She nodded, satisfied, and went to make coffee, and I stood in the doorway of the empty room with my heart full to its edges. We did not move in together quickly. That was never going to be our story. We were 2 people shaped by patience. Me by temperament, Renata by the long discipline of protecting herself from wanting things too much. And we understood instinctively that what we had was worth building slowly, the way a good structure is built, with attention to the foundation before anything else. For the first year, I stayed at my apartment on Mercer Street and drove to Solvang on weekends. For the second year, I drove to Solvang most weekdays too, until the distinction between staying and living there became philosophical rather than practical. By the third year, the apartment on Mercer Street had become a place where I kept boxes I hadn't unpacked, and a plant that Jade watered when she remembered. And the craftsman house on the tree-lined street had become the place where my coffee cup lived on the second shelf, and my notebooks accumulated on the desk in the good light room, and my name was the one Renata said when she woke in the morning, before she was fully awake, and still said what she meant without the edit. Jade was, as she had promised herself on the frost-covered porch that December morning, strange about it for a while. Not cold, not resentful. Jade was constitutionally incapable of sustained coldness toward people she loved, but navigating something internal that she processed in her own time and her own way. There were a few months where our dynamic shifted slightly, where the easy fluency between us developed a small hesitation, a half-beat delay before the familiar rhythm reasserted itself. I gave her that space without making her feel observed in it, which was harder than it sounds for someone built the way I am. And then one evening, about 7 months in, she called me from her studio and said, without preamble, "Okay, I've figured out the box." I waited. "It's the same box," she said. "You were already family. The label just changed." I had to set the phone down for a moment. When I picked it back up, she was laughing at me for crying, and everything between us returned to its natural frequency and has stayed there since. Dominic, the sculptor with kind eyes and terrible taste in music, turned out to be completely worth saying yes to. Jade said yes to dinner, and then to a second dinner, and then to a weekend in Big Sur, that she came back from with the expression of someone who has found something they didn't know they were looking for, and isn't quite ready to say it out loud yet. She was ready to say it out loud approximately 3 months later, when she told us over Sunday dinner that she was in love with him, and that she was terrified, and that she needed us to be embarrassingly enthusiastic about it to counterbalance the terror. Renata reached across the table and put her hand over Jade's in the same steady, deliberate way I had come to know intimately, and said, "Good. He seems like someone worth being terrified for." Jade beamed. I poured more wine. Dominic joined us for Christmas that year, bringing a sculpture he'd made for Renata as a gift. A small abstract thing in pale clay that she placed on the shelf next to the photograph of the 2 women in front of the mountains. And I noticed her looking at both of them sometimes, with the expression of someone taking an honest inventory of their life and finding it, finally, sufficient. My thesis became a book. That happened in the 3rd year, in the way that the best things happen, not as a dramatic arrival, but as the quiet culmination of a long accumulation of work. A letter from a publisher on a Tuesday morning when the kitchen smelled like coffee, and Renata was at the table with her drawings, and I read it twice standing in the hallway, and then walked into the kitchen and handed it to her without saying anything. She read it, and then she set it down on the table, and she stood up and held my face in both hands and looked at me for a long, unhurried moment in the way she had learned to look at things she wanted to remember clearly. "I knew," she said. Simply that. And then she kissed me, the way she always did, with the full, quiet attention of someone who has decided that this particular thing deserves their complete presence. And outside the kitchen window, the garden was green and overgrown in the good way, and the wisteria was beginning its slow climb back up the fence, and the house on the tree-lined street held us the way it had always held everything it loved, with the solid, undemonstrative permanence of something that was built to last. There is a photograph on our shelf now, next to the one from the mountains and next to Dominic's pale clay sculpture. Jade took it last summer, on an afternoon when none of us were paying attention to being photographed, which is the only way the best photographs happen. Renata and I are in the garden, standing close together in the late afternoon light. And I am saying something that I no longer remember, and Renata is looking at me with that expression. The one I spent 4 years collecting evidence of, the one she used to catch and correct before it could fully form. In the photograph, she is not catching it. She is not correcting it. She is simply letting it be there, on her face, in the light, permanent and undefended. When Jade showed it to us, I looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then I looked at Renata. And Renata, who had once kept every curtain drawn, and every window latched, and every light burning invisibly behind a carefully maintained exterior, looked back at me with those storm-glass eyes that had gone entirely clear, and said, "That's a good one." I said, "That's the best one." And she smiled, fully, without catching herself, and said, "Yes, I think it might be." I still have the habit of noticing things I'm not supposed to notice. I don't think that will ever change. But what has changed is this. The most important thing I have ever noticed, in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and old wood on a Tuesday evening in October, was not a secret. It was an invitation. Renata had left the door open, the thinnest fraction, and she had let me hear what was true. And she had trusted, perhaps without fully meaning to, perhaps more bravely than she knew, that the right person would understand what they were being offered. I understood. I walked through. And every morning in the house on the tree-lined street in Solvang, in the good light room she built for me, I sit down at my desk and I write. And somewhere in the house, I can hear her moving through the kitchen with that unhurried economy of motion that I know now, like I know my own handwriting. And sometimes, not always, but often enough to mean everything, I hear her humming. For anyone who has ever been afraid that wanting something too much would cost them everything, this story is for you. You deserve the person who stays. You deserve the open door. And you deserve, at the end of it all, to be heard humming in a kitchen that finally feels like home.